This is TWiT.
Qualcomm settled its antitrust issue with the Chinese government yesterday. The San Diego, California-based mobile chip giant agreed to pay $975 million in fines to the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission. They also agreed to give Chinese companies a better price on both chips and 3G and 4G technology licenses. Patrick Moorhead is an analyst for More Insights and Strategy, and he wrote an opinion piece for Forbes. Welcome to you, Patrick.
How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great, thank you. Now, can you briefly explain what Qualcomm was accused of by the Chinese antitrust authorities?
Sure. So in China in 2007, they passed some anti-competitive laws, and essentially Qualcomm was accused of violating these monopoly laws, specifically the price that they charged for essential patents that went into 3G and 4G modems. And essentially, the government came back and said, okay, you're guilty of these, you need to pay a fine, and then you also need to lower your price by around 35% on these essential patents. And these patents go to people like MediaTek, who would then sell that modem through to a Xiaomi or Lenovo.
So, Patrick, in your opinion, do you think Qualcomm was guilty here? Did they actually participate or lead monopolistic practices?
Well, no, you're doing good. Well, essentially, these new laws that were passed in 2007 are very, very difficult. I mean, 50 American companies that I was doing research on have been pulled up in front of this board. So they are some of the strictest definitions of being a monopoly. So according to that, they probably were. But according to pretty much every country around the world outside of China, they aren't restricted in what they can charge for these essential patents.
Now, it seems to me like this is a bit of a shakedown. I mean, I'm first of all curious about whether or not the Chinese government is holding Chinese companies to these same laws. And secondly, what is the settlement exactly? Can you give us more detail about what Qualcomm now has to do?
Sure. So let me address the settlement and what Qualcomm needs to do first. Then I'll go into some thoughts on what the Chinese government's doing here. So the first thing is they need to pay a $975 million fine, and that's right up front. The second thing they have to do is lower their prices on the essential patents on 3G and 4G and LTE. And what that means is where they normally got 3.5% to 5% of the price of the phone at 100% of the price of the phone, they now can only charge that based on 65% of the price of that phone. And really net for those essential patents, it's a 35% reduction. The other thing is it relates to contracts, is they have to be very careful in how they do contracts on the bundling of, let's say, their applications processor and a separate modem. And there are a lot of details, which essentially, though, nets out to this discount that they have to do. Let me talk about the government for a second. So there has been a tremendous amount of angst since 2007 over these anti-monopoly laws the Chinese government has brought out. And what it seems to be, since the Chinese economy has cooled off, is there's been a lot of discussion about shakedowns, or the thought of, okay, invest in the country, give a discount on essential patents and other type of patents, and everything can go well. And companies from Microsoft to Mercedes-Benz to BMW to SmithKline, Glaxo, I mean, all of these companies have gone through the same thing. SKG actually had to pay a $114 million fine over what was called bribery. So given the fact that the same types of terms and conditions aren't being challenged by, let's say, the EU or even inside of the US, I could see where some could consider this a shakedown.
Hey, Patrick, whether or not it's a shakedown, the thing that I find real interesting here is, you're talking about a nearly $1 billion fine. You're talking about price cuts, et cetera. and yet Qualcomm stock is going up. Are investors viewing this as like sort of a slap on the wrist and or closure that will allow Qualcomm to now focus on its business and growth?
Yeah, so I'm an industry analyst, not one of these stock analysts, but what's clear is over the last year, there's been a little bit of a cloud hanging over the Qualcomm stock. When you think about all the potential growth that's going to happen in China and the uncertainty that was built into how is Qualcomm going to be successful in China, it held back the stock, made people really afraid to do a long-term investment. What you're seeing now is a complete erasure, or we've closed the chapter on this Qualcomm book in China, and we're off to the new chapter, which is really being able to compete head to head with people in China. Now, the interesting thing about this whole thing is that there were some phone makers in China who actually weren't paying royalties, and now with this ruling, they will actually be able to use the Chinese government to help them collect their royalty fees. The other reason why I think investors are happy about this is that this only applies to phones that are sold in China by Chinese companies. So if you're a Lenovo or a Xiaomi or an Oppo selling into China, this royalty structure has to be abided by. Now, if it's somebody who's actually, let's say, a Xiaomi or a Lenovo selling outside the country, let's say in India or even the US, or even an Apple or Samsung selling into China, this isn't part of the deal. So investors saw this as a bracketed type of penalty.